Welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. And today I'm really excited to be joined by actually one of our speakers from our recent Houston event, Janice Tran, who is CEO and co-founder of Kanin Energy. And Kanin we'll be hearing more about during the flow of this podcast, but their kind of core technology converts waste heat to power. And I know, Janice, you'll be talking to us about other thoughts, other plans as well. In a moment, I'll ask you to introduce yourself, but the one visual I want to leave the audiences with, that the last time I saw Janice, she was basically being mobbed by attendees, having given a bit of her story on stage at Decarb Connect in North America. And it was just a really pleasing sight to see how much excitement your participation brought with it. So anyway, on that note, I'm going to hand to you and ask you just to do your thing. Give me a bit of an intro to how you've arrived at this point in time, and then we'll have a chat about the technology and the processes that you're going through with clients.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, it was a fantastic conference. Thank you so much for putting it on, and to your team as well. But yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about industrial decarbonization and what we're doing with waste heat to power. So like you said, my name is Janice here, and I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders for Kanin Energy. We're based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and also in Houston, Texas, which is actually where I'm currently sitting today and calling in from.
Let's go first to that personal driver, so personally, and then we'll come on to what you've been doing professionally that's brought you to this point. Personally, what is it that's kind of brought you into decarbonization, climate tech, and this kind of general field?
Yeah, my personal journey started when I was really 20 years old, and I made a promise to myself one day, and it was that when I'm lying on my deathbed, looking back on my life, I want to make sure that I can say to myself, look at myself in the mirror and say, I did everything that I possibly could to help tackle climate change. And it was a big promise very, very early on in my life. And that promise has shaped a lot of career decisions ever since. And so really my entire kind of purpose in my career, my life has been about tackling climate change. And so, the latest version of that is in the creation of Kanin. This is my platform to inspire and create change through finance, through business model innovation, through accelerating kind of technology adoption. But prior to this, I was also an investor. I was a director at a fund called Generate Capital. And I had the pleasure of working with some really amazing, leading edge investors on waste related investments. And then prior to that, I worked at NRG, and I also co-founded my own nonprofit called Student Energy with a couple co-founders, and now it's a global nonprofit. But yeah, my journey has brought me through, a very unconventional path, but as maybe unconventional as it may be, it's all been guided by one thing. So it's actually quite simple.
We'll talk a little more about how some of that background plays into your experience and your kind of lens on decarbonization. But I remember you saying that you'd been at Generate Capital, and I just thought, what a fascinating background to have to then go and launch, a tech business from. So yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of experiences from that have really played a part in your success. But basically today we agreed we kind of were talking, as I often do with guests, about, okay, what's the kind of core theme that we can then obviously bring to light Kanin's work around. But you mentioned to me that one of the kind of questions that clients or prospects often bring to you is, how can we decarbonize when we're resource or capacity constrained, and that this was an area that you felt Kanin could really play into. But do you want to talk a little bit more about that particular challenge, and then we'll go into Kanin itself and talk a little more?
Yeah, so great question. So when you look at the source of emissions in different places across the world, so whether that's the United States, Canada, many parts of Europe, about a quarter of emissions actually come from industrial processes. And industrial processes are hard to decarbonize because the solutions are quite fragmented. With buildings or with transportation, the answer is often try to electrify. But in industrial processes, electrification is a solution, but there's also many other solutions as well. It's hydrogen, it's carbon capture, it's redoing the entire process, like for example with steel or cement. So that in itself is an issue. And when you look at industrial processes, over half of the energy that goes into a facility is typically wasted. That doesn't end up as useful work. And a lot of that wasted energy is actually in the form of heat. And when we looked, and when me and my co-founders looked at that kind of problem of, okay, what do we want to devote the next, year, our prime working years of our life to in the context of climate, and what are we uniquely able to solve? It narrowed down into this kind of piece of industrial decarbonization. And then also, we really liked the intersection of electricity and onto other types of technologies as well. So there's just a lot of opportunity to make processes more efficient, to look at from a more first principles basis, how do we do things cleaner and cheaper as well on these facilities.
But I think that point about that waste of the original energy that goes into any kind of heavily processed manufacturing environment, that really interests me, because a lot of the time we focus, particularly within our network or on the podcast, we focus on the process that is carbon intensive, or it's the process to make the product. But here what we're saying is, before you even get there, basically you're buying a ton of energy that gets converted into all sorts of dynamics, and then half of that or more might be wasted anyway and not actually fully realized. So talk to me a bit about the technology that you have, and how are you addressing this?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Is that there's, what if we could do something more useful with that wasted energy? And when we look at waste heat in particular, there's this technology called Rankine cycle. So steam Rankine cycle is something that's quite common. Actually, it's the backbone of the steam engine, really. What we use is the organic Rankine cycle technology. So it's like steam Rankine cycle, but we're using another type of fluid that's not water, that has a lower flash point so that we can capture lower temperatures and make it more efficient. But what it does is it's an engine or turbine, that takes in heat and then converts that into electricity. Really, it's not very, very high tech. It's just not widely deployed, which is why we're interested in trying to catalyze that technology. But it produces 24/7 carbon-free power. It's the same technology that has been used in geothermal and is quite widely kind of used throughout Europe, actually, but just not as widely deployed in the United States.
And so when an average company comes to you, what is it that they're often looking for? How does Kanin come in, and what does that project look like?
Yeah, the real problem that we're solving is not that there's necessarily waste heat that needs to be utilized. The problem that we're solving is these facilities, they are under tremendous amount of pressure from stakeholders, from shareholders, to find ways to decarbonize quickly and then also cheaply, in a least expensive way. So the problem we're trying to help with is supporting these facilities in meeting those goals and targets. So while we're using a technology that has been around for a little while, but in recent years has had some innovations, which is making it kind of more cost effective. But our real innovation is with this developer model, being able to develop projects identify these opportunities, find the right technologies, and then provide capital as well, and the execution and operations expertise. So the way that I like to put it is we, in the context of waste heat to power, we remove all the friction that's there to implementing it. When we look historically, why has organic Rankine cycle or ORC not been widely used? It's because people think it's too expensive. And so our solution was, well, what if we brought in capital that was more aligned to infrastructure, to clean infrastructure, rather than using the balance sheet of that company, which is typically expensive capital if it's not for a core business. What if we didn't use that capital And so regardless if it was, quote unquote, too expensive or not for the company, it didn't matter because we had capital those more mission aligned and also, just generally less expensive. So customers, when they come to us, they're coming to us with typically a problem, or sometimes, they don't even know how urgent that problem is. They know that they've got pressures from stakeholders and they're kind of just starting from square one and saying, well, what can I do? And they're looking at all these kind of really fancy solutions like hydrogen, like carbon capture. And when we come to them and say, hey, well, there's this heat that's being wasted right under your nose with technology that has, very little technology risk, we'll pay for it. How does that sound? And they're typically pretty excited and want to learn more. And I think from there's a really nice platform for other types of technologies as well. So I see it kind of as this gateway is, okay, let's, start with baby steps. Let's start with energy efficiency. And then from there, let's say, okay, is there something around, maybe there is carbon capture. We're already on your flue stack. Maybe from there, we can start looking at different carbon capture technologies. What about thermal storage? What about, other heat integration? So there's lots of, once you're in the facility and once you've built the trust from the facility managers and from the companies, then you can start, I think, getting a little bit more creative and becoming a true decarbonization partner. And that's really the ultimate goal, is to look at waste heat to power, but then also move beyond that to other technologies as well.
So it's kind of entering the field, entering their world in a kind of right now technology, a right now solution, which also we know from our industrials, there is a lot of interest in those other kind of big tech solutions, which are some way off, bluntly. Most of those kind of hydrogen, large scale carbon capture and other, those are things that are maybe 8, 10, 15 years off. Whereas what you're saying is you come in, you have a right now solution, and on top of that, other things can be built. So I can see why it appeals, and therefore why you were being mobbed in Houston. So
yeah, and I think like there's two parts of it. So everyone's got to start somewhere, and I think having sympathy for the sustainability folks or those folks from the companies that are tasked with these very aggressive solution or targets and have to come up with these solutions that they weren't necessarily trained to look at, and especially in the case of waste heat to power, navigating carbon markets, navigating electricity markets, and those processes, it's just a lot of work. It's hard knowledge to come by, and if you were to do it by yourself, it's kind of nearly impossible, right? So I think being sympathetic, like let's start with something that works, and then for them to build the expertise and the credibility within their organization to go do more expensive, more risky technology risky things. And then on our side for Kanin, we also just have to build that credibility and respect as well. Like, we're coming into these facilities that have been operating a certain way for oftentimes decades. And for us to kind of come in and say, well, we want to change your process, or, I think we can't start there. I think we have to start with, well, let's understand what you're currently doing. Let's make it cleaner. And then from there, we've earned the trust to go do something a little bit more kind of outside the box. So
can you just paint a picture, if I own a cement plant and I come to you, like, literally, what is it that happens? What is it that you're connecting? How do you bring that tech into my facility? And then I'm going to ask you 2 more follow-up questions, which our industrials will always ask, which is, what's the space requirement and how does it interact or affect kind of my existing operation? So just paint that picture for us.
Yeah, so we would run these pipes that have a cooling liquid, and though that liquid would then take the heat from whatever process we're gathering from. So that could be an exhaust stream or even like a liquid stream. And from there, we would transport that heat into a heat exchanger, and that heat exchanger would then run through to the organic Rankine cycle, and that ORC then produces electricity. And so we can collect, with this pipe, we can collect heat from multiple different sources. So we don't have to just be on one exhaust stack, we can collect from multiple exhaust stack, and then kind of pipe it to a central collection point and heat exchanger, and then do our work from there. And the outcome is clean power. And that clean power can either be exported to the grid, or it can be sold back to the facility to displace their consumption of electricity that can have, oftentimes a very high concentration of coal or gas on the grid. And so you can decrease your scope 2 emissions that way. There's also the possibility that you can take the heat and put it in other places as well. But we actually really like the power piece, because it's a pretty uniform commodity, doesn't require as much reintegration. And then, once you have that electricity, you obviously can do a lot of things with it. Like you can create even hydrogen, or obviously run your facility. But you can also use electricity to run carbon capture. And so that's the next thing that we're also looking at is, since we're on the exhaust stacks of many of these facilities, which is where the carbon is coming out from, it's also a great place to be scrubbing for carbon as well. And since we're literally on the exhaust stack, and we're creating clean power, and we're touching a heat source, it's a perfect complement to point source carbon capture. In terms of the footprint, it varies, because you can actually build this quite vertically, but we do get this question of how does it intrude in our process? And the way that I like to put it is, it's like, think about putting something at the end of your tailpipe. Like it's literally at the very end of your process. We're not integrating right into the middle. And so, we would hate, for instance, if we were to go down, we would shut down an entire, cement facility or refinery. Like that would be terrible. And we probably wouldn't be a company for very long. So we really look for heat sources right at the end, the exhaust streams at the very, very end. And so regardless of where, how we operate, and if we shut down, there's literally no impact to the facility itself. We have a louver that just kind of shuts off, and then the exhaust streams would just go to where they were previously being emitted, and there's kind of status quo path. Whereas when we put this up, we divert all the exhaust streams into our own stack, and that's how we collect the heat.
Yeah, I was remembering actually that when you were mentioning that this could be a neat add-on to a carbon capture process, I think that's actually how we first got introduced as a member of our network, who's a Canadian lime producer, and I think they had been looking for ways to offset the cost of a future carbon capture solution, and that was how I guess you had come into their field of vision. So that's interesting, as an enabler of something that is a expensive, complex undertaking. It's sort of an interesting role to play there.
Yeah, and when we've done our analysis of carbon capture with waste heat to power, we see that it actually increases the returns of the carbon capture facility. So I think the biggest challenge with companies right now is the market conditions just aren't quite ripe for carbon capture. It's just a little bit too expensive at the moment. And that's why we tell our customers, well, do waste heat to power now. And then when the market conditions are right, say that's in 3 years or 5 years, you've already, you've done something. So you've when talking to your stakeholders that are concerned about this, that you're doing something rather than just talking about this technology in the future. You're actually doing something with waste heat, and then when you bolt on, it actually improves the economics of your carbon capture facility, because you're generating your own electricity, plus you're taking the heat from this. So sorry, let me back up here. With waste heat, we typically are looking at very high temperature exhaust streams. And when you have point source carbon capture, that technology is typically a lower temperature exhaust stream. So we're able to cool it down to a temperature that's perfect for that carbon capture system, and do something useful with it, rather than just kind of throw that temperature away. And so there's that kind of synergy that the two technologies coupled together allow for. And that usually translates to better economics as well, once you actually install the carbon capture system. Yeah, and again, like especially in an environment where Kanin provides the capital too, so there's no real kind of risk to your balance sheet, we can do that for you.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, I know when we spoke again, sort of the first time about doing the podcast, you alluded to the fact that the work you do also helps people optimize carbon credits as part of this process. Can you just remind me, and obviously tell the audience, how does that piece of this work?
Yeah. So we often get confused with EPCs or engineering firms, or we get confused for consultants. So we're a developer, and what a developer does is we look at the entire commercialization strategy along with the technical strategy for that project. And the commercialization strategy is heavily dependent on electricity sales and carbon market, and the carbon market and the sale of those environmental attributes. So oftentimes this is actually where, when a facility wants to do these waste heat to power projects alone, they get stuck because they don't really understand to the intricate detail that our team does how to navigate those markets. And there's multiple markets that you can sell into, whether you want renewable energy credits, whether you want offsets, whether you want compliance credits or voluntary credits, which market in the voluntary space you sell to, or in the compliance space, how do you do that? So that's the role of the developers. So we go and we not only just figure out, but we optimize what that revenue strategy is. And it's constantly changing. I mean, with this, there's a proposed legislation that just came out like last week that could really change the market, right? And also in Europe, there's like multiple different markets that are happening as well, different protocols that you can apply to. So again, like our job here is to try to increase the revenues as much as possible. And different than, say, just a consulting firm or an engineering company who just focuses on, they have expertise in one thing. So whether that's consulting, it might be like just creating the business case for it, or an engineering company might be trying to optimize for the best technical solution. Where we come in is it's a lot more holistic, and it's typically the entire picture of like, how do you optimize the revenue, and that actually will impact the design of your process as well. So it's this kind of complement of the different types of functions and considerations that make a good economically viable project actually come to fruition.
And then in terms of the stage that you're at, where is the business right now, and what is it that you're working towards as your kind of next step?
Yeah, so our company is growing quite quickly. We're a pandemic baby. We started right at the very beginning of the pandemic in 2020, and it's been great to, as more doors have opened, literally like with the pandemic kind of restrictions kind of lessening, it's been great to see this new stage of our company now. But yeah, we're a pretty new company. We're about 13 people now, and we recently opened up our office in Houston. And actually, the conference, Decarb Connect, back in March, was one of the deciding factors of hey, we really need to be in this city and set up a more permanent location here. So you did, yeah. I see you cheer. You did your job, guys. Yeah. So we're quickly expanding. We just made a press release a few weeks ago announcing our partnership with a midstream company called Tallgrass Energy, where we're working on 4 waste heat to power projects on their natural gas pipeline in Ohio and Indiana. So that's 48 megawatts of clean power being sold to the grid from heat that's just wasted. Got a lot of other projects to announce pretty soon as well on steel and other natural gas pipelines and other processes, which unfortunately can't share quite yet, but maybe in the next time that you have me on, I can talk at length with those. But yeah, no, I think we're just really excited, not just because obviously growing a company is amazing, but we're just excited by the feedback that we're getting from the industrial community of there's this, it's maybe being at the right place at the right time, but being kind of embraced and welcomed. Our solution being welcomed has been a really nice feeling, because we're here to solve problems. We're not just here to try to cram a technology down people's throats that don't want it. We're here to solve a problem. And I think with all the customers that we're working with, we see that they see us as a real solution provider, which is nice.
Well, let me do a bit of a kind of a pivot then to talk about something a bit different, which I did. Anyone listening, I did pre-warn Janice that we would talk about this. So I was interested to, I guess, pick your brains, get your thoughts as both a female founder, but also a woman of color, what your perspective and experience has been in both leading a startup, gaining interest, gaining traction. You hear horror stories, you hear these amazing stories. What's been your kind of perspective and experience of it?
Yeah. And Alice, I think you should chime into this as well, being also a female founder. So I think that I'd be naive to say that being a woman and a minority, that and also, I have the fortunate or unfortunate luck of looking also younger, and so there's a prejudice there as well. So I'd be naive to say that when I go into business meetings that it doesn't probably trigger some kind of conscious or unconscious bias with the person that I'm speaking with. In my career, in finance and in energy, especially, working with industrials, which are often not minority females, sometimes that does come off in a different way. And I can see that, sometimes visibly or subtly in the people that I'm speaking with. I wouldn't say that it's like very, very common, but it's certainly happened. And I think when you're in those situations, you kind of have a choice. You say, well, I can feel like I'm a victim and, go home and, be sad about it and, have that trigger some kind of insecurity in myself, or kind of just say, well, I might change their opinion. Maybe that it's a fact of like pattern matching. Maybe if we can show them that a female minority leader on the other end is, very competent, can provide a solution to the problem that they're seeking, maybe that kind of starts to chip away at that conscious or unconscious bias. Maybe we can create a new pattern of, association there. Also, it might not happen, and they might just be like that forever. And in that case, well, at least you tried. But this, you can't lay victim to this mentality of, you're different and therefore, you should either stop trying, like then they win, right? Like that's, you can't have that happen. So regardless of whether or not, there is a bias that is kind of creates a negative outcome, there's nothing you can really do about it other than, be your authentic, true self, do good work, be nice, be compassionate, and help them solve a problem. And at the end of the day, if they don't want to change their opinion or, they continue being, stuck in the past, then they're going to stay stuck in the past. And that's great. And oftentimes, when we're in these situations, I see maybe a person on a team, or maybe it's the leader of that team has this mentality, this kind of prejudice or bias, but their team members don't. And I think, we're sitting at this cusp here where society is very much shifting to embracing diversity. And people will retire, people will leave, and other people will take their place, and those people might not have the same mentality. So it's just such a more complicated answer than the
headlines would have you think.
Exactly.
Yeah. I suppose that the piece of it that no one can control is what happens before you even get the meeting, right? That's probably the piece that who knows what the reality is there. But my experience is obviously different for all kinds of reasons. One, I definitely do not look younger than my age. And two, I'm working more in a service sector business. It's not, a tech business. So I think there's all kinds of reasons why it's different. But my observation from my own experience is once you get the meeting, actually the fact that you may be different from other founders or other people you've worked with is actually normally has been a relatively positive thing, because the fact that you do come in with hard facts, or the fact that you do come in with hard experience and relationships you can point to and so forth, actually is a sort of, the package is a memorable standout perhaps to others that they may have encountered. But of course that's maybe a slightly glib answer, because none of us know what the impact of what the decision is before you get given a meeting or not. But have you had to, I'm sort of guessing you're not someone who would have changed how you present or how you present yourself to the world. And I also wonder whether having that background in investment and making investment decisions, maybe that gives a whole other layer of confidence to this issue anyway. I don't know what you make of that.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's because I have that investment background and I have some experience behind me in deploying real dollars and catalyzing industries. I think, yeah, I think that certainly does help. But to your point, like, you make a decision whether to, I think kind of earlier on as a leader, as a female leader, you make that decision of, who do you want to be? How do you choose to show up? And you make that decision kind of every day. But generally, like, do you choose to be kind of your authentic self and bring that to a meeting? And at the end of the day, for me, it's just, be my authentic self and just do good work. That's kind of it's almost as simple as that. And to stray from that, I think then it gets complicated, at least for me, right? So, and part of being that authentic self is I'm a numbers person. I like to be, I'm quite logical. So I like to just come in with the facts, and I'm very prepared for these meetings as well. And so just kind of coming in and kind of being, quite open, but also very much to the facts. I think that helps kind of, helps with that credibility. And I think my background with the training of being an investor helps me craft these narratives that are quite compelling as well. So I think part of that is my training, part of that is just kind of where I come from, but I think part of that is just like how I show up and also not to downplay like how my team shows up. We spend a lot of time prepping, and one of the core values that we talk about in our team is making the other partner feel like they are in the hands of professionals and treating them like we were once in their shoes, want to be treated as well, like coming across very polished, professional, prepared. That's all very, very important.
Who else from that group of 13 was on the original co-founding group? Was it a pair of you, or was it more of you that came together?
Yeah, so there's two other co-founders and myself, so 3 co-founders in total. So Jake Bainbridge, he's our Chief Technology Officer, and Dan Fipke is our Chief Development Officer. So have been there actually since the beginning, and they Jake and Dan, they actually came up with the idea to work on waste heat to power. They were previously working at a geothermal company, and they recognized that when you drill in the ground, there's a lot of risk associated with drilling, and to sell electricity, a commodity that's not priced like oil and gas, which has the kind of margins and the risk margins incorporated into it. The kind of risk reward is not necessarily there. I think it's changing now for sure, but at least 5 years ago it wasn't the case. And so they started on this path of looking at waste heat to power because you don't need to drill in the ground. You can actually prove those resources above ground. And Dan, who I've known for almost 15 years, we went to kind of undergraduate university together. He, told me about this concept, and so that's how I kind of got brought in and lured in, and was able to use a lot of the experience that I built at Generate Capital in catalyzing the anaerobic digestion space, and kind of putting all those skills in practice, and did this here on waste heat to power. But yeah, the team is fantastic. There's no way that I could be here talking to you if it wasn't for my fantastic co-founding team, and also the wider team as well, which is just my pride and joy. They're amazing, super smart, talented folks that care about the environment and what we're doing here.
And you mentioned earlier on that, so you've just opened Houston. I'm now going to tell people it's because of Decarb Connect's Houston event.
It's not wrong.
Yeah. But so how is that kind of the Canadian and the US experience driving you forward? Is it a similar story each side of the border, or are you finding different, I don't know, are there different conversations, different dynamics at play?
Yeah, definitely different dynamics. I will always be a Canadian at heart, even though I've lived many, many years in the United States and spent the bulk of my career in the United States. I love Canada, and I think what what Canada is doing in terms of climate and leading on climate policy is fantastic. I think, though, the reason why we did end up opening an office in Houston is because the business community is a little bit different. And while we're in Calgary, which is the energy capital of Canada, we're finding that it's just not quite as kind of quick to adapt as we're seeing in Houston. And I think that has to do from a cultural perspective, also from just a simple like people and size are just much smaller than Alberta is smaller than Texas. And while it is very kind of entrepreneurial, Calgary is very entrepreneurial. It's just not quite as entrepreneurial as the fourth largest city in the United States, which is Houston. And as a startup, you got to just kind of go where there is business. And so we're trying to, as much as we can, build our presence and build customers in Canada. But the reality is a lot of our customers are actually in the United States now. And so that's why it made sense to be in Houston.
Yeah, I have to admit that the little I've kind of come to understand about how Houston is adapting to the energy transition, because I know there's loads more stories than I'm aware of. What is really fascinating to me is there's a real kind of city-wide, region-wide commitment to bringing in and nurturing early stage tech so that there's, I don't think anyone says they're ditching the old school industries either, but there is that investment and there is that commitment there, which I think when you come from an outsider in is kind of surprising, because you have this image in your head of, oh, Houston's going to be like that and the Houstonians are going to think like this. And the truth is, there is a huge dynamism around the energy transition, and particularly where it comes to early stage companies, I think.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of credit here due to Greentown Labs. And so that's where we're actually based out of right now. That if you haven't, for all your listeners, if you're in and around Houston, you come through Houston, please go to Greentown Labs, introduce yourself to the folks there. They've just built this amazing kind of energy transition center that houses startups, but also is the kind of center for a lot of the events that happen and a lot of research and thinking that happens around energy transition in Houston. And then, I've lived in New York. I've worked in San Francisco, and that's where I was living in for 5 years. And while there's just so much innovation that happens in San Francisco and a lot of kind of innovation that happens in New York, it's different living in a city where all like the bread and butter is energy, right? Like it's not just a fringe ecosystem that's like the bread and butter. And so I think that the seriousness of energy transition, the seriousness, and also the opportunity, financial opportunity that an energy transition provides, it's just different. Like living in Houston has been like living in San Francisco, but everything is just, is tailored towards energy and the stuff that you care about, which is really, really cool. And I'm really enjoying my time here.
And it probably helps that you have 25% of the US's petrochemical complex on your doorstep.
Yeah, exactly. Belly of the beast, right? I think that while a lot of the folks in San Francisco are creating ideas and living in this kind of idealistic, I want to say, bubble, we gotta move those innovations over to Texas, to Houston, and then put that in the field. And so I'm seeing that bridge being built actually quite quickly. We need it to happen faster. A part of that is the responsibility of those tech companies and investors in Silicon Valley, but part of that is also the responsibility of the companies that, those petrochemical companies seeking out those innovations from the Valley as well.
Well, Janice, thank you. Yeah, a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. And that announcement about Tallgrass Energy, we'll make sure we put a link to that just as an example of some of the things you're working on in the show notes for the podcast, so that people can take a little look. And hopefully we'll get you back on, a year's time or whenever is appropriate to talk about some of these at scale projects that you're developing. So thank you again. Great to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the team at Decarb Connect for doing what you're doing in the industrial decarbonization sector. Thank you.
Many thanks for listening to the Decarb Connect podcast. We work with clients across the industrial sectors, specifically those who are tasked with decarbonising the most energy intensive products and materials that we use every day. If you have an interest in learning more about either our members network, our reports, or our event series, do get in touch with us at decarbconnect.com. Or if you'd like to take part in the podcast, email me, Alex, at ac@decarbconnect.com. Thanks for listening.